Alright guys, so today I'm going to do a tutorial of this image in Blender and in Photoshop. Alright, so first of all, I'm doing a 4000 by 5000 pixel image with 300 resolution and just with these settings. So for the very first step of my edit, I took the image right here and I used the pen tool and I selected the subject really carefully, very precisely, and when I finished, I went ahead and right click, make selection, and I did that by 1 pixel. All right, cool. So once I got the cutout all ready to go, I was ready to import it into Blender. So this is my final cutout. I did some frequency separation, so I'll show you guys that as well. And it's just in the face. This is a technique that high-end beauty retouchers use in like magazines and stuff. So it's really effective for skin retouching. And then what I did was I just separated the texture and the color, and I kind of blended the colors together a little bit right there just to kind of touch up the image. And I made sure to not change the shape of his nose or his face at all, because it's really easy to change that stuff. So you kind of just have to be aware of that and kind of just go back and forth and see that it's not super drastic, but it is a skin retouching. So I did that and I got the cutout. Save that as a PNG. So I right click, save that as a PNG. And then once I had that in my file, I opened Blender. Okay, so once we're in Blender, I have this layout. If you guys want this layout, I have a video for that. So let me know if you want that and I'll link you the video. Yeah, it's really nice. I really like this layout. It's super clean and I can have my render over here and my workspace over here. So normally this is going to be in solid and this side will be in rendered because this window is much smaller. So it will make it less intense on my computer. And that's really important because it's very intense. So once I come into Blender, I'll press Shift A and go to image and image as plane. So if you guys don't have that, just go file or go to edit, preferences, and add-ons and type image and make sure that's checked so you can have image as planes. And so just Shift A and go down to image as planes. I'll go to my Photoshop cutouts and I have this guy right here. I'll import that and it imports a perfect cutout of the image I want to work with. So this is what I came up with. So as you can see, there's 2 of them. Here's how I do this. So I need the image to build composition in Blender, and I like to have the shadows consistent with the other shadows. So I want to make that inside Blender and not inside Photoshop. So in order to do that, I just duplicated this by pressing Shift D and duplicated that. If you go to the object properties, if you see, I can uncheck the camera and ray visibility and it will remove it from the render, but it will keep the shadow. So that's basically what this second one is. It's just the shadow and it's consistent with the way the subject looks. So the shadow will reflect exactly. So you kind of just have to kind of gauge this, because like in Photoshop, you can take the image and kind of manipulate this area to make it look better. So I wasn't too worried about this like it not looking good, but I wanted to make sure that we have a good shadow going. And also for the feet, there's always like a dark shadow underneath the feet. So I used just a sphere, and what I did was I went into edit mode by pressing tab, and I kind of I made sure the wireframe was on, and then I just deleted the vertices here and kind of just manipulated this into, you know, a foot shape. You know, doesn't have to be perfect. I just wanted the shadow. And the same thing, I just took off the camera visibility and we're good to go. I'll go into the output and I'll make sure the resolution is consistent with my Photoshop file. And that's what that is. So yeah, I got the composition going. I've got the subject in the image. And I started building the scene. So I just put in a mesh and a plane and I expand it. I make sure the perspective is super good. It's important. Perspective is so important. So I spent a really long time kind of just messing with the camera angle. The camera has to be consistent with the image that you're uploading. So if it's like down here, the perspective will be so incredibly off that like the feet will be going up here, but the horizon is down here. So we don't really want that. So you want to try your best to see like the camera angle and try to gauge what that would look like in real life, and just kind of put the camera where that would be. All right, so with the camera selected, I just use a focal length of 24 millimeters. It looked like the image was taken in about 24. So like if it's like a really close up shot, like you can even go like 200 or whatever, you know. But like it just depends on, like, you want consistency with the actual image. That's very important for this type of thing. So I did that. I got the perspective going. I have the ground going, and now the fun part is building the scene, the rest of the scene. For me, what I really like to do, I like to use this software called Cargo by Kitbash. And these guys are so insane at making these kits. These kits are absolutely incredible. Let's go to the models real quick. So what I use for this one, I actually use a free model for this one. So it was this, and I didn't really use very much else. I just used that one and just kind of duplicated stuff around. Shift D, duplicate, you know. You can literally just make any kind of world that you want to. That actually kind of looks cool, but so I just kind of duplicated stuff around. I really like this thing here because it kind of looked like a blood elf type of thing. Maybe not exactly. So important things as well is lighting. Super important. I do pretty much the same thing for lighting every time because it looks good. So what I do is I have these planes here. I shift A, I go to import image as plane as well, and I go to like let's see, downloads. So here's a sky, right? I got some more cosplayers right there, but yeah. So I'll just import this as an image, and then once it's imported, I'll scale it. I got a lot. I don't know why it's upside down. Rotate that by 180. For this, I'll just put this in front so you guys can see what I'm doing. Over here on the render, this is my shader editor. Okay, so for this shader, I'm going to take the image. The color is just the image, and I'm going to put that into the emission, and then I'll just put that at 20 so you can see what's going on over here. Okay, so it's really bright, and you can do literally any picture of a sky and have it emitting light behind there. And it will emit light and it will do reflections. So this is just a cube with a water shader on it, and so that's reflecting. This is super nice. And then I just put it on the sides to make it emit light because like the world is round. All right, so for the trees, I did use a paid add-on, but you guys can find a bunch of stuff on CG Trader. There's some free trees in there if you guys are like interested in some plants in your scene. I spent like $100 on this, and it literally has so much stuff. It's definitely worth the money I spent back then. It's like 4 years ago I spent $100 on this, and I've used it like almost every time I logged on to Blender. Like it's so incredibly good. You have so many things. Like if I wanted this mushroom, I would just spawn the asset, right? Scale that up like a lot, and just like have a mushroom in here. Now we have a mushroom. You know what I mean? It's so good. It's definitely worth $100 for me. And it has all these trees, like so many trees. That's what I use for plants and like flowers and all kinds of stuff. So it's really nice. For the lights, I just use a point light for this one. So I go light, point light, and this is a power of 10. So if we go into the camera view, you can see it like it's reflecting really nicely. So I knew that I wanted to make his Ashbringer glow. So that's why I have the light right there. And then so for the wings, it's just the same thing. Import image as plane, and I separated both of the wings so I could you know, do this type of thing where I can only affect one wing at a time. But yeah, so that was nice. Okay, so for the big light back here, I like to put a really, really big light. So I'll just go to the light and I do a spotlight for this one, and I just put it way back here going this direction with a very, like, really, really wide. So you can make this narrow or wide. And yeah, that's what I did for that. And that was at 2 million power. So that's quite a lot of power for a light, but it's like a one light situation. So it's like moonlight going on over here. That's what I like. And it's important to not overdo lighting unless you're like super like skilled at it. It's easy to mess up like lighting and make it look a little messed up. That's why I only have like one light and then like another light behind the subject and one in front. So yeah. And it's important to be consistent with the lighting of the subject. So there was a backlight, and I picked this image specifically because I wanted the backlight, and it's just a really, really interesting type of lighting. You can do a lot of different types of things. But yeah, this is my asset library, and I just have this water that I use like every single time I do an edit. And this is just the node setup right here, if anyone's interested in that. And I just use this water, and I barely put it above the floor right there. And yeah, the floor is really, really complicated sometimes for me, because you have to have like a really good balance of performance in your PC and making it look good. Here's the floor node setup, and what I did was I went to the material tab. I went down to the surface and made sure that goes from bump only to displacement and bump. And then I increased the scale. So if you increase this, so 0.5 instead, you can see that it goes higher and it has more detail. Yeah, I wanted it a little bit more subtle. Also, like for the floor, you have to have a lot of mesh going on so it can have the detail in there. So if I press tab, you guys can see I subdivided this. So if you press A, right click, and you subdivide, I did that by 100, and then I did it one more time. So it's like a lot. So that can become really, really heavy. So I just tried to do enough to where you couldn't see detail anymore, but not too much to where it's gonna mess up the speed of my PC. Also, I added a subdivision modifier, and I did that by 2. All right, so the floor is super heavy, so that's why I do that like the very first thing, and it helps with perspective as well. I just make sure the floor isn't so heavy that I can't move my screen. All right, so another thing is this big box here. All I did was Shift A, go mesh, cube, scale the cube up a lot. And if you go to object properties and go to viewport display as, you can go to bounds. And now whenever you click the object, it doesn't click the object unless you click the bounds on it. And then for the shader on this, I just go to new. I delete the principled BSDF and Shift A, and I'll do volume. You can either do volume scatter or principal volume. For me, I do principal, and I just reduce the density 0.005, and that's how I'm getting this. Okay, so you can see the color is white, but on the rendered view, it's not white. That's because of the world settings. Okay, so my world settings is here. This is what I'm doing for that. I changed this a lot. You can have this background selected and press Control T to do a node wrangler setup. And if you don't have node wrangler, you just go to edit preferences and you go to add-ons and you go to node wrangler and make sure that's checked. And then you can Control T on the background to get an environment texture with a mapping node and a texture coordinate node as well. And it'll just do it for you. You don't have to import it or think about it, which is really, really nice. All right, so you can also go into your HDRI. You can get these from the internet. You just look up free HDRIs and you can find a bunch of free ones, and you can have all kinds of different lighting in your scene. I really like this one a lot. So instead of having that color, we're going to this HDRI. So if you do this initially, it's going to look like this, right? So if you go to your render settings and go all the way down to film, you can uncheck transparent and it will keep the lighting, but not the background. So this is good for like, if you want to only have a floor and you want to render out a floor, but nothing in the background, you can do that. And it will just be the floor like cut out in PNG format. It's really, really nice. So I did a lot of different experimenting with that. And this is what I came up with because it made most sense in the scene. So if I change this to like, green, you can see how it affects it. So I wanted the shadows to be a nice color. So I just went with like a more of a orangish tone, even though like the background and the lighting is blue. I found that like if I went blue, it was too much. I wanted a little bit of different color. So for cinematography, what they do is they use the 60-30-10 rule. So 60% one color, 30% another color, and then 10% another color. And it looks super clean and nice. So this is way too much blue for me. That's why I went with a different color. So for the wings on the shader editor, I'll go to object and I'll show you guys. So this is the image that I was working with right here. And this one is the UV editor right over here. So this is that. And the color is what makes it go into the scene. So this is what it is in the scene. So if you go color and you go straight into the emission, it will emit light and it will make it brighter and it will actually emit light into the scene, which is really, really cool. I wanted it to be a little bit more red. So I went ahead and used RGB curves. I went and reduced the blues, and the opposite of blue is yellow. So I went down and then red went up on the reds. So that made it a little bit more orange. So if I go down, it makes it more cyan. So the opposite of red is cyan. The opposite of green is magenta, and the opposite of blue is yellow. So you kind of have to remember that. But yeah. So I went up in the reds and down in the blues to make it this color. After that, I had my scene going and I had everything going good. And so for my render, I went to the render settings and I did a denoise on the render with a 5000 sample. I checked noise threshold to reduce the time. All right, so I'm going to show you how to render your image a little bit faster. And what you want to do is go to edit and preferences. And in the system, if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, OpticX is super, super fast. I also use my CPU to render, and that helps as well. Also under the render settings, the light path's important. I use these settings right here, and it's usually good. If you see some weird transparency shapes in there, it's just because your light path transparent is not high enough. So you want to just make sure that's as low as possible without getting any weird stuff in the image. So I like 7. It's pretty nice. If you reduce this, it reduces your render times as well. So that's really good. And yeah, just like pretty much just leave everything like that. But it's a good idea to kind of just check that. All right, so once I did that, I went render, and all I did was render image, and it started to render the image. One more thing though, before I render, I make sure that the subject is hidden in the render. So this is what the render would look like in the end. Because I don't want to render the subject in Blender. I want to use Photoshop to make it look super nice. So now in Photoshop, we've got the subject here, and I just imported the image that I was working with. And then I just put the subject over that. All right, so I had to do like a lot of touching up because it's just too hard to get everything super perfect. I'd rather just do some manipulation in Photoshop. What I did was I'll just like go through here. What I did here was I pressed J and they have this really, really awesome new thing. It's called Remove Tool. And what it does is like it will just, you can just select something and it will use AI to make it look super nice and clean. So nice to have. So that's what I did right there. And I just touched that up because it was like really janky looking. And I was like, okay, I cannot make this look good. So I have to just remove it and then add my own shadow. What I did was I went like this on the layer, make sure the layer is selected, press Control C, Control V, and I just moved that over here to get like more of a realistic shadow. And I right click, flip horizontal, and I just kind of put this about, you know, right there. And I used the mask and Control I to invert that. And I just kind of painted in like a super realistic shadow, and I made sure like none of the edges are there, so it's like more realistic. And this is just like more shadow underneath the subject, so if you can see, like that's way more realistic. Shadows are super important. This layer is just getting rid of extra stuff that was like going through the scene that I couldn't see in the render. So I just removed imperfections that don't make sense, like a leaf going through concrete doesn't make sense. And so for this layer, it's just I painted with a very, very low flow, like well, I guess it was like 50%, then just tiny select the color there and just kind of just paint the extra hair going on. Now I didn't do this in order like this. I did this like in a few different orders. So initially I put in the background and then color graded the subject right away. So in order for me to color grade the subject, I'll go up here and just make a new curves adjustment layer over that group. So if I put a curves adjustment layer up here and I brighten it like this, you can really see the colors way better. So I went ahead and did a color grade to change the coloring on this to kind of match the scene a little bit more. Normally you want to color grade the subject along with the shadows, but for this image specifically, there was a lot of blue. So if I were to go like a blue color, like if I were to try to match the shadows like this and go like blue, and this is kind of matching it, maybe a little bit magenta, like a lot more blue. So this is kind of like matching the rest of the scene a little bit. But if you look at it, it's just like way too much cool tones. So I went with like a more warm color. This was kind of weird. Like usually I go red and yellow to do warm color, but just really wasn't really working for me. So I kind of wanted like a little bit of a blue hue, but like I wanted more red as well. So this is kind of weird, but yeah. I think that it worked for me. And then I just continued to build on the subject, changing the tones and like matching the scene as best as I could. So for this one, I'm looking at the shoes here. They're modern shoes in a fantasy world. So I wanted to change that. So here I just lowered the exposure. This one I pressed J and used the AI tool to get rid of the modern look to the shoe. And it was just too dark, so I increased the exposure and I just touching the stuff up there. And then, okay, so for this one, it was like a big exposure adjustment layer. Okay, so here is where I give the Ashbringer a glow. And so what I did was I wanted to change the color. So I added a hue and saturation adjustment layer right there. These are the settings I use. So I reduced the saturation, I increased the lightness and just changed the color right there. Made sure colorize was checked. I double click the layer and I use blend if to get rid of it. Okay, so if you see the hand right here, it's light on the edges. So I wanted to take this hue and saturation adjustment layer and I wanted to take that out of the light parts. So this is the lightest parts of the image that are being taken away. Okay, and I wanted to feather that a lot to make it look a little bit more natural. And that's what I did for that. Okay, so for the next layer, exposure was too much. So I went down on the exposure, I added another exposure layer. And I wanted to, so this was because I wanted to make it brighter in the center, but I ended up just doing this in the end. So yeah, so it's like bright, and then yeah. So that's what I did for the glow there. And then I added some more stuff later. But so for this one, this is a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and I just colorized that into a certain color because it was too yellow. I wanted it a bit more red because Blood Elf Paladin. So here's the glow on the Ashbringer again. So I just added a new layer, added a screen adjustment, screen blending mode. This next one is a color dodge blending mode. So if you want nice glows, you go screen and then you add a color dodge. And these are different in the way of opacity and fill. So for screen, you want to use opacity. And then for color dodge, it's always fill. If you use opacity, it's like it doesn't give you the effect very well. So this is my go-to glow effect. Just screen and then on top of that color dodge, and it just like it looks so good every time. And so I wanted to add a bloom on the wings because they're epic. All right, so for the next part, I press Control Alt Shift E, and it will compile everything into a brand new layer. And that's a really, really good thing to do. So like if you increase something and you don't want all that information and press that again, it will cut it. So so I pressed that new layer, right click, convert to smart object, and I have that key bound to Control W, so it's really, really quick. So I'll just Control W, smart object. And smart objects, super important. You can change the settings if you have a smart object, and also if you increase the size of something, it won't pixelate. So it's very, very important to do. I go filter, camera raw filter, and I will just go through that and show you guys the settings to change that into this. So in order to do this, these are the settings I use. So I reduce the highlights, increase the contrast a little bit, and the exposure a little bit. I increase the shadows quite a bit, and the whites. So I decrease the highlights and increase the whites. And then I made sure the blacks weren't too washed out. I increased the vibrance by 2. Decrease the clarity. So with the clarity, it's like a super a lot of people say never to use this and just add contrast specifically to the areas that you want to. So I reduced that to give it like a glowing glow. But if you do it too much, the face kind of gets a little bit funny looking. So I did that. And I did that by -14. I always use a vignette. I like vignette, and I feathered that quite a bit to make it more feathered on the edges. So I also like to use the blue primary down in the calibration to give it kind of a more of a teal and orange look. So if you want like a super teal orange look, you can go down in the blue primary. I didn't want it that much, so I just went down by like 5. So those are the settings for camera raw, and this is what I came up with in the end. So it's not like too crazy. You don't want to go too crazy with colorings. So for this next adjustment layer, it's a curves adjustment layer, and I just masked out just the front part of the subject. For this one, it's just an exposure adjustment layer. So hue and saturation adjustment layer with the mask. His face was a little bit too saturated and vibrant from all the editing. So I wanted to make sure that like I didn't like make the skin tones too drastically different, which I mean they are at this point, but yeah, I just want to always make sure I go back and make sure I'm not drastically changing the look of the subject. I've done that in the past, and there have been people that were angry at me for that. I learned from that mistake. So for the color balance adjustment layer, I double click, took that out of the shadows, and I feathered that, or I took that out of the highlights and I feathered that quite a bit. So same thing with this one. This one is just a highlight version of that, and I took it out of the shadows instead. So I'm focusing on highlights on this one and shadows on this one. So if I go here, go to shadows, I increase that by 6 on the blues to make it a little bit more blue in the shadows. So on this one, I go to the highlights and I actually increase the blues on the highlights as well. Sometimes I really like this look where it's like just blue. But yeah, that's what I did for the color grading. Okay, so here's a bloom effect that I really enjoy doing. So it's just a screen blending mode, and I selected a color here, and I just use a really soft brush. Bloom. I kind of wanted to make this look a little fancy. I don't know why, I just did that. So this exposure adjustment layer is completely masked out except for the face. So right here, I'm adding depth to the image by adding some highlights on the cheekbone and on the lower chin. And that's a good way to add some depth to the image as well. Okay, so this one is for the forehead. I wanted to do that separately. So I could change the opacity separately. Okay, so this curves adjustment layer is just a little bit up in the mid-tone section. And I just brightened the face because I kept looking at it and it's just too different from the original image. So I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing anything crazy. Okay, so this hue and saturation adjustment layer is reduced by 9% in the saturation. And for that, this was for the hands. So I'm still looking at the skin tones and I'm like, man, I really don't want to mess up his skin tone. So I reduced the saturation in the hand as well. So the vibrant adjustment layer is just increased by 14. Color lookup, I use the Fuji. I like this one a lot. I reduced the opacity to 26%. So this is a more complicated adjustment layer. It's a black and white adjustment layer. If I add a black and white adjustment layer, it will go black and white, right? And if you press Control Y, you can see up here, it goes to S gray. So if I take off black and white and just press Control Y, you can see that it goes to this. And this is super accurate when it comes to tones. So it's better than really anything else that you can do. So just Control Y and you can see tones without the color, which is important. Tones are so important. So for this adjustment layer, we're gonna go black and white and we're gonna go to luminosity, and this will do tonal contrast. Tonal contrast can be really powerful, and it can also be like really bad if you do it too much. So for this one, it always automatically goes into a different tonal contrast when you add it. So you kind of like, if you want to actually change it consistently, you can like kind of do this and make sure that it's you know, the same contrast as the initial image that you were working with. So you can try to get it like close, and then if you just continue to build on this, you can see the tones are being contrasted a lot. So this is what I came up with in the end. I masked out his face because it was affecting it way too much. So this is what I did with the tonal contrast. Control Alt Shift E to compile everything to a new layer. Convert that to a smart object. I added a unsharp mask. So I go filter sharpen and I go unsharp mask. And these are the settings I use for this image. So if it's a smaller image, I'll use a threshold of 1 instead. Like if it's a 1920 by 1080 image, I would do that. But since it's 4000 by 5000, I kind of need to increase that threshold a little bit more. So here I did end up increasing the size because if you see down here, this line right here, I didn't notice it and it was distracting me so much that I was like, okay, I'm gonna just pull that down so it's not distracting. It just didn't look good to me. So I increased the image, which is generally you don't want to do that, but since it was just like a small area, I went ahead and did do that. So this hue and saturation adjustment layer is just in the yellows. I decreased the saturation. I was looking over here. I did not like the color because the vignette made it like darker and more contrasted. So I reduced the saturation in the yellows right there and it looked better to me. All right, so for this layer, I just Alter Option and press New Layer, go to Soft Light on the blending mode and fill with 50% gray. Now we have the 50% gray layer. Control W is my keybind for smart objects. I went to Filter, Noise, add noise. This is really, really good for editing because you put things into the scene that weren't there initially, like this lighting right here would have different noise levels than the subject around it. So in order to combat that, I just put a noise adjustment layer on top of everything. So if you look closer, it's way more consistent. So like this painting that I did has noise in it now. So that's consistent with the rest of the image as well. And that's noise levels are really, really important for this type of thing as well. In the end, I wanted to increase the reds because my monitor has different colors than my phone. So my monitor is like a little bit skewed and kind of different colored. So I checked my phone for the colors and I decided to add a selective color adjustment layer. And in the reds, I went opposite of cyan is red. And I increased that and it gives a really, really good clean saturation to the reds only. I just did that by -44. And this is the final image that I came up with.